Ethan Miller walked through the halls of Riverside High School in worn jeans and a faded gray hoodie, never drawing attention to himself, never causing trouble, never fighting back. To Blake Thornton and his pack of privileged bullies, Ethan was the perfect target, someone they could humiliate without consequence, someone who would never stand up to them. For months, they cornered him in hallways, mocked his simple clothes, destroyed his belongings, and posted videos online to shame him in front of the entire school. Ethan endured it all with quiet dignity, never once mentioning who his father really was. They had no idea that the calm, disciplined way Ethan carried himself came from growing up as the son of a Navy SEAL. When Jack Miller finally came home and discovered what had been happening to his son, what happened next left everyone speechless. Ethan Miller sat in the farthest corner of Riverside High School's library, tucked between towering shelves of forgotten textbooks and outdated encyclopedias where the afternoon sunlight barely reached. At 17 years old, he had perfected the art of occupying space without claiming it, of being present without being noticed. His worn jeans had faded from black to a tired charcoal gray, the knees thin from wear rather than fashion, and his plain gray hoodie hung loose on his lean frame. The drawstrings frayed at the ends. A second-hand backpack rested against the leg of his chair, its fabric patched in 2 places with duct tape that Ethan had applied himself with careful precision. He turned the pages of his chemistry textbook with steady hands, absorbing information with the kind of focused discipline that most of his classmates could never muster. Around him, the library hummed with the soft sounds of teenage life. Groups of students clustered at the popular tables near the windows, their designer bags and expensive laptops arranged like territorial markers. They laughed too loudly, whispered too dramatically, performed their social rituals with the confidence of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Ethan watched them sometimes, not with envy but with the quiet observation of someone studying a different species. He noticed who sat with whom, who held power, who followed, who pretended not to care while desperately caring about everything. He saw the hierarchies as clearly as if they were drawn on a map, but he had no desire to climb them. His father had been away for the past 4 months, somewhere Ethan could not name even if he wanted to, doing work that Ethan could not discuss even in the vaguest terms. People at school sometimes asked where his dad was, what he did. Ethan always gave the same answer, delivered in his characteristically calm voice that discouraged further questions. "My father works for the government." It was technically true and revealed absolutely nothing. The other students eventually stopped asking, deciding that Ethan's father was probably some low-level bureaucrat or absent parent who did not matter. At Riverside High, what mattered was legacy, wealth, and name recognition. The Thorntons had donated the new athletics complex. The Whitmores had an academic wing named after them. The Suttons owned half the commercial real estate in town. These families ruled the school as surely as nobility had once ruled kingdoms, and their children wore their inherited power like crowns. Ethan Miller, with his quiet ways and simple clothes, did not even register on their scale of importance. He was invisible, irrelevant, beneath notice. That was exactly how he preferred it, at least for now. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Blake Thornton entered the cafeteria like a king surveying his domain. His Letterman jacket, pristine white leather with royal blue sleeves, the golden embroidered patches catching the fluorescent lights as he moved through the crowded room. At 18 years old and standing 6 feet tall, Blake carried himself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything in his life, whose father's name opened every door, and whose family's money smoothed every inconvenience into irrelevance. On his left wrist, a Tag Heuer Aquaracer caught the light with every gesture. $1,800 of Swiss engineering that he checked compulsively, not to know the time, but to ensure others noticed it. His dark hair was styled with expensive product into calculated casualness. His designer jeans cost more than most students' entire wardrobes, and his smile was a weapon he deployed with surgical precision, dazzling when he wanted something, and cutting when he encountered anything beneath his standards. Behind him walked his constant companions, Chase Whitmore and Derek Sutton, satellites orbiting their sun. Chase was lean and sharp-featured, all angles and nervous energy. Wearing a polo shirt with the collar popped and boat shoes without socks, his entire aesthetic screaming old money summer homes and country club memberships, Derek was broader. A linebacker who had discovered early that his size combined with the Sutton name made him untouchable. His expensive athletic wear always perfectly coordinated, his baseball cap worn backward in that way that seemed casual but was carefully cultivated. The three of them commanded the center table in the cafeteria, the spot everyone could see, where lesser students parted like water as they approached. Blake dropped his bag onto the table without looking, knowing someone would move it if it was in the way, knowing the world rearranged itself to accommodate him. He snapped his fingers at Mrs. Chen, the cafeteria worker who had served lunch at Riverside for 20 years, gesturing for her to bring him a bottled water, not asking, not saying please, simply expecting service as his birthright. When she brought it, he did not thank her, did not even look at her face, just waved her away like she was part of the furniture. Chase laughed at something on his phone, showing Derek a video of some freshman who had tripped in the hallway, both of them mocking the kid's stumble with cruel exaggeration. Blake straightened his Letterman jacket, a gesture he performed dozens of times per day, adjusting the collar and smoothing the sleeves, a physical manifestation of his need to maintain perfect presentation, perfect superiority. His eyes scanned the cafeteria, cataloging who sat where, who wore what, who mattered, and who existed only to make him feel powerful by comparison. When his gaze passed over the scattered students sitting alone or in small nervous groups, his expression shifted into something cold and evaluating, his signature sneer curling one corner of his mouth upward in contempt. These people, his face said clearly, were beneath him, and he would make certain they never forgot it. The collision happened at the intersection of B hallway and the main corridor, during the chaos of passing period when hundreds of students flooded the spaces between classes. Ethan was walking close to the lockers on the right side. His chemistry textbook, a worn notebook, and his copy of The Things They Carried balanced in his arms because the zipper on his backpack had broken that morning. He was focused on navigating the crowd, keeping his head down, moving with purpose toward his next class, when Blake Thornton stepped directly into his path with the kind of deliberate timing that could only be intentional. The impact was sudden and forceful, Blake's shoulder driving into Ethan's chest with enough power to send him stumbling backward. The books exploded from Ethan's arms, pages fluttering as they scattered across the scuffed linoleum floor. His notebook landing in a puddle of someone's spilled energy drink. The hallway noise seemed to dim as students nearby stopped to watch. Sensing drama, smelling blood in the water, Blake stood over the mess he had created, adjusting his Letterman jacket with slow deliberation, his sneer already in place. "Watch where you're going," he said loudly, though everyone present had seen him change direction to cause the collision. His eyes traveled down to Ethan's sneakers, generic white canvas shoes from a discount store, with the rubber separating from the sole on the left foot. "Nice kicks. Did you get those from a dumpster, or does Goodwill have a clearance section I don't know about?" Chase and Derek materialized beside their leader, laughing on cue, and Chase added his own observation about Ethan's hoodie, asking if that was vintage or just ancient. Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, the kind that started from his diaphragm and filled his lungs completely, a calming technique that had become automatic over the years. He did not respond to the insults, did not meet Blake's eyes, did not give any indication that the words had landed. Instead, he crouched down and began collecting his books with methodical precision, checking each one for damage, carefully wiping the sticky residue from his notebook. His hands did not shake, his jaw did not clench, his face remained neutral and composed. Blake watched this non-reaction with visible frustration, his sneer deepening because the humiliation only worked if the victim showed pain. "What's wrong? Can't afford to replace them if they get damaged." Blake pressed, but Ethan simply continued his task, silent and dignified. Then Sarah Chen, a junior with kind eyes and her mother's gentle nature, knelt beside Ethan and began helping him gather the scattered pages. "Here," she said softly, handing him his chemistry book. And the simple act of kindness hung in the air like a rebuke to Blake's cruelty, showing everyone watching exactly what decency looked like in contrast to entitled malice. 3 days after the hallway incident, Ethan sat at a corner table in the cafeteria with his tray of food, a simple lunch of pasta with red sauce, an apple, and water that he had brought from home in reusable containers to save money. The cafeteria was packed with the usual lunch period chaos, voices echoing off the high ceilings, chairs scraping against floors. The smell of industrial pizza and overcooked vegetables hanging in the air. Ethan had chosen this table specifically because it was far from the center where Blake and his friends held court, tucked against the wall near the emergency exit, where he could eat in relative peace. He was halfway through his meal, reading a chapter for English class that he had propped against his water bottle, when a shadow fell across his table, and Blake Thornton's voice cut through the ambient noise with aggressive volume. "What are you doing sitting here?" Blake demanded. Loud enough that conversations at nearby tables stopped, heads turning to witness whatever entertainment was about to unfold. Chase and Derek flanked him in their usual formation, blocking Ethan's path to stand up, trapping him in his seat. "This section is for people who actually matter at this school, not charity cases wearing Walmart specials." Ethan looked up from his book, his expression calm and neutral, and said nothing, which only seemed to fuel Blake's aggression further. Blake leaned down, his hands on the table, his face close enough that Ethan could smell his expensive cologne. "Did you not hear me, or are you just too stupid to understand? People like you eat over there." He gestured dismissively toward the tables near the trash cans where the most isolated students sat, with the rest of the nobodies. Derek, perhaps sensing that Blake wanted escalation, reached out and knocked Ethan's tray with the back of his hand, a casual gesture of violence that sent the pasta sliding off the plate, red sauce splattering across the table and dripping onto Ethan's worn jeans, his apple rolling onto the floor where someone's shoe immediately crushed it. The cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of students watching with wide eyes, some with phones out already recording, but none of them moving to help, none of them willing to risk becoming the next target. Ethan took a deep, steadying breath, that same calming technique from the hallway, filling his lungs slowly and completely, while his mind remained clear and focused. He reached for the napkins he had brought, began wiping the sauce from the table with careful, methodical movements, his hands perfectly steady, his face showing no anger, no humiliation, no reaction whatsoever. Blake watched this with visible frustration, his jaw tightening, because every insult seemed to bounce off Ethan like rain off stone, and the lack of response made Blake look like he was punching air. Mrs. Chen and another cafeteria worker stood behind the serving counter, watching the scene with troubled expressions, but they did not intervene because Blake's father was on the school board, and complaints had a way of disappearing when they involved the Thornton family. The harassment became a rhythm, a predictable pattern that marked the passing weeks like a cruel metronome, counting down to something inevitable. On a Monday morning in late October, Ethan arrived at his locker to find the word "Loser" spray painted across the metal in dripping silver letters, the paint still tacky to the touch, and when he opened the door, his textbooks had been removed and replaced with garbage from the cafeteria, rotting food and sticky soda cans that had leaked onto his spare notebook. He cleaned it out methodically, used his own supplies to scrub away what he could of the graffiti, and said nothing to anyone about who had done it, even though he had seen Derek holding a silver spray paint can the previous Friday. In gym class on Wednesday, Chase stuck his foot out as Ethan ran past during a basketball drill, sending him sprawling onto the polished wood floor hard enough that his knee split open and bled through his shorts, and when Coach Morrison asked what happened, Chase shrugged and said Ethan must have tripped over his own feet. Clumsy as always, and the coach looked at Ethan with something like pity, but did nothing because the Whitmore family had funded the new gymnasium. The hallway comments became constant background noise, a soundtrack of cruelty that followed Ethan between classes. "Hey, poverty case, did you eat today or are you too broke?" Blake would call out, his voice carrying across crowded corridors. "My dog has better clothes than you," Derek would add. and Chase would make exaggerated gestures of holding his nose when Ethan passed, suggesting he smelled bad. Even though Ethan was meticulous about cleanliness, despite his limited resources. Each time, Ethan walked past with that same calm demeanor, his face betraying nothing, his pace never quickening to escape or slowing to confront, just steady forward movement like water flowing around obstacles. Teachers noticed. How could they not? But when Mrs. Patterson mentioned the harassment to Principal Henderson, she was quietly reminded that the Thornton family had just pledged $500,000 for new computer labs, and perhaps it would be better to avoid unnecessary conflict over typical teenage dynamics. Mr. Reeves in history class watched Blake mock Ethan's presentation and said nothing because he knew the Sutton family could have him fired with a single phone call. The pattern continued, escalating in small increments, and through it all Ethan maintained a discipline that seemed almost superhuman, a core of strength that did not bend or break under pressure. On a Friday afternoon, standing at his locker gathering books for the weekend, Ethan paused and looked at a small photograph taped inside the door. A picture of a man in military uniform, and the details too grainy and small for anyone passing by to make out clearly. But the way Ethan looked at that image, with quiet reverence and something like determination, suggested he drew strength from it in ways nobody at Riverside High could possibly understand. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the student parking lot as Ethan walked toward the bike racks where he had locked his 10-speed that morning. His backpack heavy with weekend homework, his mind already planning the quiet hours he would spend studying at home. He heard them before he saw them, the sound of expensive shoes on asphalt, the low laughter that carried a predatory edge, and when he turned, Blake Thornton stood 10 feet away with Chase and Derek spreading out to flank him, cutting off any easy escape route. This was different from the hallway confrontations or the cafeteria incident. More isolated, more dangerous, the kind of situation where things could escalate without witnesses to impose even the minimal restraint that public spaces provided. Chase moved first, stepping forward and shoving Ethan hard in the chest with both hands, forcing him to stumble backward until his shoulders hit a concrete support pillar near the bike racks. "Not so calm now, are you?" Chase said, his voice pitched higher with excitement, and Blake began to circle Ethan slowly, deliberately, like a wolf evaluating wounded prey, his sneer firmly in place and his designer watch catching the afternoon light. "You know what I've been wondering?" Blake said conversationally, his tone false and mocking. "Where's your daddy? We never see him at school events, never see him pick you up, never hear you talk about him. What's wrong? Is he too ashamed to show his face? Did he take one look at his loser son and decide to just disappear?" Derek had his phone out now, holding it up to record, the red light indicating he was capturing everything, already planning how he would edit this footage to maximize Ethan's humiliation, how many views and shares it would get when he posted it online with some cruel caption about deadbeat fathers and pathetic kids. Blake stepped closer, his face inches from Ethan's, and continued his taunts. "Maybe he's in prison. Is that it? Or maybe he's just some nobody working a nothing job and you're too embarrassed to admit your family is garbage." Ethan's jaw clenched for the first time, a muscle twitching in his cheek, because they could mock his clothes and his circumstances, and even him. But bringing his father into it crossed a line they did not understand, insulted a man who had sacrificed more than these entitled children could comprehend. But even with anger rising in his chest, Ethan did not raise his fists, did not shove back, did not give them the fight they wanted, because his father had taught him that discipline meant controlling yourself, especially when you wanted to lose control. The sound of a car engine approaching made Derek lower his phone, and Mr. Reeves's sedan turned into the parking lot, and the three bullies scattered immediately with laughter echoing behind them, leaving Ethan standing alone against the pillar with his fists clenched at his sides. By Monday morning, the video had spread through Riverside High like wildfire, shared and reshared across every social media platform the students used. Viewed hundreds of times before first period even began, Derek had edited it with cruel precision, adding mocking text overlays and sad violin music. Zooming in on Ethan's face during Blake's taunts about his absent father, cutting the footage to make it seem like Ethan was on the verge of tears, even though he had maintained his composure throughout. The caption read, "When you realize your whole family is nobody trash," with laughing emojis, and the comments section filled rapidly with cruel jokes and mockery, students who had never spoken to Ethan suddenly feeling brave enough to insult him from behind their screens. The hallways became a gauntlet of whispers and stares, groups of students huddling around phones and pointing as Ethan walked past, some laughing openly while others watched with uncomfortable expressions but said nothing in his defense. In pre-calculus class, Ethan heard two girls behind him discussing the video in stage whispers clearly meant for him to hear, debating whether his father had abandoned the family or was just too ashamed to be associated with such a loser son. At lunch, Sarah Chen found Blake at his usual center table surrounded by his admirers, and she walked right up to him with her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her voice shaking with anger as she called him out. "What you did is cruel and disgusting," she said loudly enough that nearby tables went quiet. "Ethan never did anything to you, and you're destroying him for entertainment." Blake looked at her with that signature sneer, leaning back in his chair with exaggerated casualness, and waved his hand dismissively like he was shooing away an insect. "Maybe if he wasn't such an easy target he wouldn't get targeted," Blake replied, and his friends laughed, and Sarah walked away with tears of frustration in her eyes because she had no power to stop this. Ethan saw the video during study hall when another student held up their phone as he walked past, forcing him to watch his own humiliation, and for the first time since this nightmare began, something changed in his expression. His jaw tightened, his eyes went cold and hard, and a flicker of genuine anger crossed his face. Not because they had mocked his worn clothes or his quiet nature or even his dignity, but because they had insulted his father, a man who had served his country with honor and sacrifice, a man these spoiled children were not worthy to even speak about. And that crossed a line that Ethan could not ignore. The area behind the gymnasium was hidden from most of the campus, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt bordered by a brick wall on one side and a chain-link fence on the other, where maintenance stored equipment and students sometimes went to skip class or smoke cigarettes they thought nobody would smell. Ethan had taken this route as a shortcut to the bike racks, a decision he regretted the moment he rounded the corner and found Blake, Chase, and Derek waiting for him, positioned like they had planned this ambush, like they had been tracking his movements and knew exactly where to corner him. The atmosphere was different this time, heavier with intent, and Blake's sneer had transformed into something darker and more dangerous, his eyes hard with the kind of anger that came from feeling like his authority had been questioned. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Blake said, advancing on Ethan with deliberate steps. "Walking around all quiet and dignified, like you're above it all, like our words don't touch you. I'm tired of it." Before Ethan could respond or retreat, Blake shoved him violently, both hands against his chest with enough force to slam him backward into the brick wall, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending pain shooting through his shoulder blades. Chase moved in immediately, grabbing Ethan's backpack and ripping it from his shoulders, unzipping it and dumping the contents onto the ground with vicious satisfaction, textbooks and notebooks and pens scattering across the dirty asphalt, pages tearing, his carefully organized homework fluttering away in the afternoon breeze. Derek circled around with his phone already raised, recording from a better angle this time, his expression excited and hungry for the violence he knew was coming, already imagining the views and comments this video would generate. Blake stepped closer, pinning Ethan against the wall with his presence, and raised his right fist slowly, making a show of it for the camera, letting Ethan see it coming, letting the fear build. "Time somebody taught you your place," Blake said, his voice low and mean. "Trash belongs in the trash, and I'm going to put you there." Ethan's mind raced through his options, calculating distances and angles with the kind of tactical thinking his father had drilled into him since childhood. Knowing he could defend himself, knowing he had been trained in ways these boys could not imagine, but also knowing that fighting back would only make everything worse, would give them exactly what they wanted. His muscles tensed, preparing for the impact, his jaw set with determination to endure whatever came next, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Blake's fist drew back further, his sneer widening, and just as his arm began to move forward, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. Calm and controlled, and carrying absolute authority. "That's enough." The man emerged from the shadows near the gymnasium's rear entrance, moving with a fluidity and purpose that seemed out of place in the mundane setting. Each step deliberate and economical, covering ground efficiently without appearing to rush. He was in his late 30s with short dark hair going gray at the temples, an average build that would not stand out in a crowd, wearing simple faded jeans and a navy blue jacket that had seen years of use but was meticulously maintained. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance at first glance, nothing that would make him seem threatening or impressive to three entitled teenagers who had spent their lives assuming their wealth and status made them untouchable, but something in the way he carried himself commanded immediate attention. A bearing that spoke of absolute confidence and controlled power. This was Jack Miller, home 3 weeks early from a deployment he could not discuss, arriving at the school to surprise his son, only to witness the final stages of months of torment playing out behind the gymnasium. His voice when he spoke was not loud or aggressive, but it cut through the air with the kind of authority that made people obey without questioning why. The voice of someone accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. Blake turned toward this interruption with visible annoyance, his fist still raised near Ethan's face, his sneer twisting into something uglier as he evaluated this civilian who dared interrupt his business. "This doesn't concern you, old man," Blake said with all the dismissive arrogance of someone who had never encountered real consequences. "Walk away before you get involved in something you can't handle." Jack took 3 more steps forward, closing the distance with measured precision, and the atmosphere shifted immediately like barometric pressure dropping before a storm. His eyes, sharp and assessing, moved from Blake to Chase to Derek, cataloging threat levels and body language with the automatic evaluation of someone trained to read combat situations in milliseconds. He did not raise his voice, did not threaten, did not make any aggressive moves, but something about him radiated quiet power that made Derek's phone hand start to tremble slightly and Chase take an unconscious step backward. Jack's gaze settled on Blake, and when he spoke again his tone remained perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, and somehow that made his words more intimidating than any shouted threat could have been. "Son, you have about 5 seconds to take your hands off my boy and step away." Blake hesitated for only a moment before his pride and need to maintain dominance in front of his friends overrode whatever survival instinct might have been whispering warnings in the back of his mind. He lowered his fist from near Ethan's face but stepped forward toward Jack instead. Puffing his chest out and squaring his shoulders in an aggressive display meant to intimidate in his height and youth and expensive athletic training, making him believe he had some advantage over this average-looking man in his late 30s. "You must be the deadbeat dad we've been hearing about," Blake said, his voice dripping with contempt, trying to wound with words since his physical intimidation was not having the desired effect. "Funny how you finally show up now. What you gonna do about it, old man? You think you scare me?" Jack's expression did not change. His hands remained visible and open at his sides, non-threatening and relaxed. But his eyes never left Blake's face, reading every micro-expression and calculating exactly how this situation would unfold based on the teenager's body language and tone. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and precise, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the kind of certainty that came from years of making life or death decisions in environments where hesitation meant failure. "I'm going to give you a choice," Jack said calmly. "You can walk away right now, apologize to my son, and we can all forget this happened. Or you can continue down this path and learn a lesson about respect the hard way. I'd strongly suggest you choose the first option." Blake laughed, a harsh sound meant to show his friends he was not intimidated. But there was a slight edge of uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "You think you can teach me anything? My father owns half this town. One phone call and you'll be arrested for threatening minors." Derek, who had been recording this entire exchange, suddenly went very still as his camera focused on Jack's jacket, zooming in on a small metal pin affixed to the left side near the zipper. A golden trident with an anchor and eagle clutched in its talons, barely an inch across but unmistakable to anyone who knew military insignia. Derek's face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks as the implications of that small pin crashed through his consciousness like ice water, and his phone hand began to shake noticeably, the video footage becoming unstable. "Blake," Derek said, his voice coming out higher and tighter than normal. But Blake was not listening, still focused on maintaining his dominance over this man who refused to be intimidated. Derek grabbed Blake's arm urgently, pulling him back half a step, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that trembled with fear. "Blake! Stop! That's a SEAL trident!" Blake glanced at Derek with irritation, not understanding why his friend suddenly looked like he had seen a ghost, not comprehending the significance of a small metal pin on some middle-aged man's jacket. "So what? What are you talking about?" Blake said, his voice still trying to maintain its aggressive edge but wavering slightly at Derek's obvious terror. Chase, sensing the shift in atmosphere but equally confused, asked nervously, "What's a SEAL? Like the animal?" Derek's eyes never left Jack, who stood perfectly still with that same calm expression. Not moving, not threatening, just waiting with the infinite patience of someone who knew exactly how this situation would resolve and had no need to rush the process. Derek's explanation came out in hushed, frightened tones, words tumbling over each other as he tried to make his friends understand the magnitude of their mistake. Navy SEAL, not the animal. Special operations. They're like the most elite warriors in the entire military. They go through the hardest training in the world, Hell Week, where most people quit, underwater demolition, learning to kill in about 50 different ways. They're the guys who took out Bin Laden. They're the ones who do the missions nobody else can do, the impossible stuff. Hostage rescues and counterterrorism. They're trained to survive anything, fight anyone, and they're the most lethal human beings on the planet. The color drained from Chase's face as Derek's words sank in, and Blake's sneer faltered for the first time, uncertainty creeping into his expression as he looked back at Jack with new eyes, suddenly seeing past the simple clothing and average build to the coiled power and absolute competence that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Jack still had not moved. His hands remained open and visible, his expression calm, but now his stillness seemed less like passivity and more like a predator allowing prey to realize exactly how much danger they were in before deciding whether to strike. The boy's bravado began cracking like thin ice under weight. Chase taking another step backward, Derek's phone lowering slightly, and Blake's aggressive posture deflating as the reality crashed through his privileged bubble, the understanding that they had spent months tormenting the son of someone who could end all three of them without breaking a sweat, someone trained by the government to be dangerous in ways their sheltered minds could barely comprehend. Jack let the silence hang for a moment longer, watching the fear take root in their eyes, then spoke with that same even controlled tone that somehow conveyed more authority than any amount of shouting could achieve. "My name is Jack Miller, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEALs. I've been deployed for the past 4 months in a location I cannot name, doing work I cannot discuss, and I returned home 3 weeks early to surprise my son." He paused, letting that information settle over them like a heavy blanket. "Ethan never told you about me. Never mentioned what I do. Never used my service or my reputation as a shield against people like you. Do you know why?" The question hung in the air and none of the boys dared answer. So Jack continued, "Because he has the discipline and character not to hide behind his father's reputation. He has the strength to endure injustice without retaliating. The dignity to face cruelty without becoming cruel himself. Those qualities don't come naturally. That discipline? I taught him that. I taught him to assess situations, to control his emotions, to choose his battles wisely." Jack took one step closer, and his voice dropped slightly, becoming somehow more intense despite the quieter volume. "I also taught him when fighting is necessary and when it shows weakness. Fighting 3 boys who attack in a pack because they have nothing better to do with their privilege? That would have been weakness disguised as strength. True power is having the ability to destroy your enemies and choosing restraint instead. My son has been showing you real strength this entire time, and you were too ignorant to recognize it." Blake's face had drained completely of color, his skin taking on a grayish pallor as the full weight of his months of cruelty crashed down on him. The understanding that he had been tormenting someone who could have ended him at any point, but chose mercy instead. His hand unconsciously went to his Tag Heuer watch, that $1,800 symbol of his status and superiority. And suddenly it looked like exactly what it was, an expensive toy worn by a child playing at power while standing in front of a man who understood real power in ways Blake's sheltered mind could never comprehend. Chase had gone completely silent, his earlier bravado evaporated, and Derek's phone hung limply at his side, forgotten, no longer interested in recording his own humiliation. Jack stood perfectly still, his hands remaining open and unthreatening at his sides, but his presence filled the space behind the gymnasium like a physical force, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of experience that dwarfed anything these boys had ever encountered in their comfortable lives. "You want to prove you're tough? Let me explain something about real strength. Real strength isn't beating up someone who won't fight back. Real strength isn't hiding behind your father's money or traveling in packs to intimidate people weaker than you. Real strength is having power and choosing not to use it. It's discipline, it's sacrifice, it's pushing through pain and fear when every instinct tells you to quit." He paused, his eyes moving from face to face, ensuring each boy understood that he was speaking directly to them. "You want to know what real toughness looks like? It's Hell Week. 5.5 days with 4 total hours of sleep, constant physical torture designed to break you mentally before it breaks you physically. It's diving in freezing water, holding your breath until your lungs scream, learning to stay calm when every cell in your body is panicking. It's carrying boats on your head until your neck feels like it's going to snap, running until your feet bleed through your boots, getting beaten down again and again and choosing to stand back up every single time. 80% of the men who start that training quit. They ring the bell and walk away because they don't have what it takes." Jack's voice remained level, but carried an intensity that made the words cut deeper than any shout. "That's sacrifice. That's discipline. That's what builds real strength. Not expensive watches and designer clothes, not picking on kids who can't fight back. You 3 have never sacrificed anything in your lives. You've never pushed past your limits because you've never had limits. You've never faced real consequences because daddy's money always saves you." Chase and Derek were visibly shaken now, backing away from Jack step by step, their earlier confidence completely shattered, and Derek's phone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered on the asphalt, but he did not bend to pick it up. Blake's sneer was completely gone, erased from his face as thoroughly as if it had never existed, replaced with naked fear that widened his eyes and made his breath come in short, shallow gasps, as he realized he was standing in front of someone who represented everything his privilege had protected him from understanding. Real power, real danger, real consequences for his actions. Principal Henderson rounded the corner of the gymnasium at a brisk walk, her heels clicking on the asphalt, her face flushed from hurrying across campus after receiving an urgent message from Sarah Chen, who had witnessed Blake, Chase, and Derek following Ethan with clear hostile intent. She stopped short when she saw the scene before her. The 3 boys who normally strutted through her hallways like they owned the school, now looking terrified and small, Ethan standing against the brick wall with his belongings scattered on the ground, and a man in simple civilian clothes who somehow commanded the entire space with nothing but his presence. "What's going on here?" Henderson demanded, her administrator voice firm and authoritative. But when Jack turned to face her and she saw his bearing, saw the way he carried himself with that unmistakable military precision, her tone shifted immediately to something more respectful. Jack introduced himself calmly, explaining he was Ethan's father, home from deployment, and had arrived just in time to prevent his son from being physically assaulted by these 3 students. Henderson's eyes widened in shock as Jack described what he had witnessed, and she turned to Blake with an expression of disbelief. "Is this true?" Blake could not meet her eyes, could not form words, and his silence was answer enough. Henderson began to apologize, saying she had no idea there had been ongoing issues, but Jack held up one hand politely, stopping her. "With respect, Principal Henderson, there have been ongoing issues for months. My son chose not to report them through official channels, but that doesn't mean he wasn't paying attention. Jack pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, tapped the screen several times, and handed it to the principal. Henderson's face went pale as she scrolled through what she saw there. A meticulously organized documentation of every incident. Photos of the vandalized locker with timestamps, videos of hallway confrontations taken discreetly by other students and sent to Ethan, screenshots of the cruel social media posts, a detailed log of dates, times, locations, and witnesses for every act of harassment stretching back 3 months. "My son learned to gather intelligence before taking action," Jack said quietly, pride evident in his voice. "He documented everything with the same discipline I taught him. He knew that if he ever needed to prove what was happening, he would need evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away." The next afternoon, Principal Henderson's office felt smaller than usual, with all the people crowded inside, the air thick with tension and the faint smell of expensive cologne that announced Mr. Thornton's arrival before he even entered the room. Richard Thornton swept through the door wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his silver cufflinks catching the light, his whole demeanor radiating the absolute certainty of a man who had spent his entire life making problems disappear with money and influence and legal threats. He barely glanced at Henderson before his eyes swept the room dismissively, landing on Ethan with obvious contempt, and then moving to Jack with the same arrogant assessment, clearly expecting to see some ordinary working-class father he could intimidate or buy off. What he saw instead stopped him cold. Jack Miller stood near the window in his navy dress blues, the uniform pressed to razor-sharp perfection, the white peaked cap tucked under his arm, and on his chest row after row of ribbons and medals that told a story of service and sacrifice that made Richard Thornton's business achievements look small and hollow by comparison. The Navy Cross, bronze stars with Valor device, purple hearts, campaign ribbons from multiple deployments, and centered above them all, the golden seal trident that marked him as part of the most elite fighting force in the world. The power dynamic that Richard Thornton had walked in expecting to control reversed instantly and completely, and for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he found himself in a room where his money and name meant absolutely nothing. Principal Henderson wasted no time, spreading printed documentation across her desk, pulling up videos on her computer screen, presenting a pattern of harassment so thorough and well documented that it could not be dismissed or explained away. Testimonies from Sarah Chen and other students, timestamps proving the systematic nature of the bullying, videos showing clear assault and intimidation, screenshots of cruel social media posts that violated multiple school policies. Blake sat in the chair beside his father, slumped and silent, looking smaller than he ever had in the hallways, where he had ruled with such arrogance, and when Richard Thornton turned to look at his son, it was not with the defensive fury of a parent protecting his child, but with cold rage at being embarrassed, at having his name associated with this behavior, at having to sit in this office across from a genuine American hero, while his privileged son's cruelty was laid bare for everyone to see. The auditorium filled with a chaotic noise of 500 students settling into seats, the usual buzz of conversations and laughter that accompanied mandatory assemblies, but the atmosphere shifted when Principal Henderson walked onto the stage with an expression more serious than anyone had seen before, and the room gradually fell silent as students sensed something significant was about to happen. Henderson stood at the podium and explained that the assembly had been called to address a serious situation that had come to light, a pattern of bullying and harassment that had gone unchecked for too long, and that effective immediately Riverside High School would be implementing a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, intimidation, and harassment of any kind. The silence deepened as she announced that 3 students, Blake Thornton, Chase Whitmore, and Derek Sutton, were being suspended for 2 weeks, would be required to attend mandatory counseling sessions, and would complete 100 hours of community service before being allowed to return to school activities. Blake's athletic privileges were revoked for the remainder of the year, meaning he would not play in the championship games his father had already bragged about to business associates, and all 3 boys would be on academic and behavioral probation for the rest of their time at Riverside. The student body sat in stunned silence, watching the fall of the untouchables. The boys who had ruled the school with impunity suddenly brought low, and the shock rippled through the auditorium in whispers and wide eyes. Henderson then invited Jack Miller to speak, and when he walked onto the stage in simple civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, some students who had not heard about the incident behind the gymnasium looked confused about why this ordinary-looking man was addressing them. Jack stood at the podium and spoke clearly and directly. Not about his military service or his accomplishments, not about the sealed trident or the missions he had completed, but about character and what it meant to be truly strong. He talked about how real courage was standing up for someone who could not defend themselves, how true strength was choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, how the measure of a person was not in their clothes or their family name, but in how they treated people who could do nothing for them in return. He told them that every single person in that auditorium would face moments when they had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. And those choices would define who they became. 2 months after the assembly, Blake Thornton pushed a wheelchair through the halls of the Riverside Veterans Center, his designer clothes replaced with a simple volunteer t-shirt and jeans, his expensive watch left at home because it felt obscene to wear it here among people who had sacrificed everything while he had sacrificed nothing. Jack Miller had arranged for the 3 boys to complete their community service at this facility, working alongside men and women who had served their country and paid prices that Blake's privileged mind was only beginning to comprehend. At first, he had been resentful, angry at being forced into this situation, treating the work as punishment to endure rather than an opportunity to learn, but something had shifted over the weeks as he met veterans who had lost limbs in combat, yet maintained more dignity in their wheelchairs than Blake had ever possessed, standing on 2 healthy legs. He listened to a Marine named Carlos describe losing both legs to an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan, and then spending 2 years learning to walk again on prosthetics, never complaining, never asking why him, just focusing on the next goal and the next challenge. He heard a Navy corpsman named Jennifer talk about the nightmares that still woke her up 15 years after her deployment. The friends she could not save, the weight of responsibility she carried with quiet grace. He watched an Army Ranger named Marcus, who had a Purple Heart and a traumatic brain injury, patiently work through his speech therapy exercises with the same determination he had once used to complete Ranger School. These people had faced real darkness, real pain, real sacrifice, and they maintained their humanity and dignity through it all. And Blake felt his own manufactured problems and entitled anger shrinking into insignificance. One afternoon, a veteran named Tom, a former Marine in his 50s with scars on his face and kind eyes that had seen too much, sat down next to Blake during a break and said quietly, "I see something changing in you, son." Blake nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Tom shared his own story of being a bully in high school, cruel and arrogant, until the military broke him down and rebuilt him into someone better. Someone who understood that real strength was protecting the weak, not preying on them. Blake found Ethan at his locker on a Wednesday morning in early December, 3 weeks after returning from his suspension, and the difference in Blake's demeanor was so complete that several students did a double take as he passed. He no longer strutted through the hallways like he owned them, no longer surrounded himself with followers who hung on his every word, no longer wore his Letterman jacket like armor or checked his expensive watch to draw attention. He walked with his head slightly down, his shoulders less arrogant, moving through the crowds instead of expecting them to part for him. When he reached Ethan's locker, he stopped a respectful distance away and waited until Ethan noticed him, then spoke in a voice that was quiet and uncertain, stripped of the sneering confidence that had once defined him. "Ethan, can we talk? Just for a minute?" Ethan looked at him with that same calm expression he had maintained through months of torment, evaluating Blake's sincerity with careful assessment. Then nodded once and gestured toward a quiet corner near the library where they would not be overheard. Blake followed, and when they stopped, he took a deep breath like he was preparing for something difficult, then spoke without preamble or deflection. "I want to apologize for everything I did to you, the harassment, the humiliation, the video, all of it. There's no excuse for how I treated you. I was cruel because I could be. Because I thought my father's money and my family's status gave me the right to treat people however I wanted. I thought being powerful meant making other people feel small, and I was wrong about that. Wrong about everything. His voice wavered slightly, but he kept going, maintaining eye contact even though it clearly cost him something. You didn't deserve any of what I put you through. You were just trying to exist, and I made that into a target. I'm sorry. Ethan listened with that characteristic calm, letting the words settle between them, then responded in his measured way. I accept your apology, Blake. I can see you've changed, or at least that you're trying to change. But apologies are just words, unless they're backed by changed behavior. The real test is what you do now, how you treat people when nobody's watching. Whether you use whatever influence you have left to protect people instead of hurting them. 6 months after the confrontation behind the gymnasium, Riverside High School had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The culture shifting from one that tolerated cruelty to one that actively rejected it, and at the center of that transformation was Blake Thornton, who had become an unlikely advocate against the very behavior he had once embodied. He used his former status and his family connections not to intimidate, but to protect. Stepping in when he saw students being targeted, using his voice to call out behavior he once would have encouraged, and speaking at assemblies about his own failures and the journey toward becoming better. He and Ethan were not friends, would probably never be friends given the history between them, but there was mutual respect now, a silent acknowledgement when they passed in the hallways, an understanding that people could change and that redemption was possible even after terrible mistakes. Chase and Derek had followed Blake's lead, each finding their own path toward making amends. Chase volunteering as a tutor for struggling students, and Derek using his size to protect rather than threaten, and together the three of them had helped create an environment where the vulnerable felt safer than they had in years. The new anti-bullying programs Principal Henderson had implemented were thriving, with student participation exceeding all expectations, peer mediators trained to intervene in conflicts, and anonymous reporting systems that actually worked because students believed their reports would be taken seriously. Sarah Chen had started a peer support group that met twice a week, providing a safe space for students who felt isolated or targeted, and the group had grown from 5 nervous participants to over 30 regular attendees who found strength in community. Ethan remained exactly who he had always been, quiet and humble. Still wearing his worn jeans and simple clothes. Still preferring solitude to social performance, but now when he walked through the hallways, students nodded to him with respect, recognizing the strength of character that had allowed him to endure months of abuse without compromising his integrity or becoming bitter. On parent-teacher night in late April, Jack Miller walked through the school in his civilian clothes. Meeting with Ethan's teachers who all praised his son's academic excellence and quiet leadership, and Jack felt a pride that had nothing to do with military accomplishments or combat medals, but everything to do with knowing he had raised a son who understood that real strength was measured not in dominance, but in dignity. That evening, Jack and Ethan sat together in their small living room, the kind of modest home that reflected their values rather than any lack of means, and in the comfortable silence between them, Jack finally addressed something that had been weighing on his mind since the day behind the gymnasium. Son, I need to tell you something. I knew what was happening to you long before I came home early. You think I don't monitor your social media? Don't have ways of keeping tabs even when I'm deployed? Ethan looked at his father with surprise, and Jack continued with quiet honesty. I could have intervened earlier, could have made phone calls or sent messages that would have stopped it immediately. But I didn't because I knew you needed to handle it your way until it crossed the line into real danger. The moment it became physical, I was there. He leaned forward, his expression serious and filled with pride. Ethan, you showed more courage not fighting back than most men show in combat. You chose the harder path, maintaining your integrity while enduring abuse, documenting everything with discipline and precision, never becoming what they tried to make you. That's real strength, and I'm more proud of you than I could ever express. Ethan felt emotion tighten his throat, and he managed to say, "Thank you, Dad, for teaching me that, for being there when it mattered." The next morning, Ethan returned to Riverside High School exactly as he had always been. Still quiet, still dressed in his worn jeans and simple hoodie, still preferring the corners and the shadows to the spotlight. But now, everyone who saw him understood something fundamental that had eluded them before. True power does not need to be displayed, does not need expensive clothes or loud voices or cruel demonstrations. It simply exists in the core of a person who knows their own worth and refuses to compromise it. The students who passed Ethan in the hallways saw not a victim or a target, but someone who possessed a strength they were only beginning to understand. The strength to endure injustice without becoming unjust, to face cruelty without becoming cruel, to hold on to dignity when everything around him tried to strip it away. The story of what had happened spread beyond Riverside High, becoming a lesson about the danger of judging character by appearance, about how the quietest person in the room might possess more power than anyone realizes, about how real change comes not just from punishment, but from understanding and transformation. Blake Thornton learned that privilege without character is hollow, that true influence comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The entire school community learned that strength is not found in dominance but in restraint, that heroes do not always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is choose not to use their power until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary to protect what matters most. One person's quiet dignity and a father's wise intervention had transformed an entire school community in ways that would ripple forward for years to come, creating change that extended far beyond the original incident behind the gymnasium. Ethan Miller had shown hundreds of students what real courage looked like. Not the loud bravado of those who needed to prove themselves through dominance, but the silent strength of someone who knew his own worth and refused to compromise it even under sustained attack. Jack Miller had demonstrated that true authority does not come from intimidation or violence, but from the calm certainty of someone who possesses power and chooses restraint, who understands that the most important battles are often won without throwing a single punch. Together, father and son had proven something that Riverside High School desperately needed to learn: that the loudest people in the room are rarely the strongest, that expensive clothes and family names mean nothing compared to character and integrity, and that true power lies in discipline, in choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, in using strength only when necessary to protect others rather than to elevate yourself. Blake Thornton and his friends learned that redemption is possible for those willing to do the hard work of transformation, that acknowledging mistakes and changing behavior matters more than maintaining pride, and that the influence they once used for cruelty could become a force for protection and positive change. The lesson extended beyond the individuals involved to touch every student who witnessed the story unfold, teaching them to look deeper than surface appearances, to recognize that quiet people might carry hidden depths of strength, to understand that real heroism often wears humble clothing and speaks in measured tones, and to remember that how we treat those who cannot fight back reveals our true character more than any achievement or status ever could.